Welcome to Capitol Dateline Online. I'm with our guest, Jim Saunders, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida. Jim, last week in the legislature was the week where issues went to die. Okay, let me hit you with a few issues. We'll talk about them. First up, gambling.
I think this is probably the biggest one that's gone to die so far. The governor's office and the Seminole tribe late last year negotiated a deal, a $3 billion deal in which the Seminole tribe would pay $3 billion to the state over a number of years in exchange for being able to offer more games at their casinos in the state. But that needed to be ratified by the legislature. So that led to bills being developed in the House and the Senate. The problem with gambling issues is all of a sudden, once it opens up, everybody piles in. There was all kinds of issues about, for instance, a big issue in this debate has been whether to allow slot machines at pari-mutuels outside of Broward and Miami-Dade County, which has been something the pari-mutuels would love because they can make very lucrative, but that became an issue in this debate. The House actually moved a bill to the floor last week that would have ratified the Seminole Compact, as well as making a bunch of other changes in the industry. But the Senate could not get it moving, and it essentially just stalled in the Senate, and the House did not take it up at that point. The House Speaker declared it dead on Friday, and so I don't think that issue is coming back. They're leaving a lot of money on the table with the Seminole tribe, and also a lot of other issues about what's going to happen in the gambling industry in the future. There are two big court cases out there right now regarding gambling, one of which involves the Seminole tribe suing the state over the authority to offer certain games at their casinos. Another big case that's sitting in the Supreme Court involves whether a small pari-mutuel in Gadsden County should be able to offer slot machines. So by the legislature not taking action during this session, essentially it's punting the issue to the courts. So this could play out over the next several months, and the federal case could actually play out longer than that, I assume. But this is something that's going to be going on, but it's going to be going on in the courts instead of the legislature, it looks like.
That seems to be the new dance, the legislature, the courts, the legislature, the courts.
Yeah, I mean, gambling is an incredibly difficult issue for the legislature to deal with. You've got all sorts of special interests involved coming at it from different angles, and then you have just a very hardcore group of social conservatives who don't want any expansion of gambling. You also have some business folks, particularly in the Orlando area, the theme park industry, don't want expansions of gambling. So you've got all sorts of competing interests, and once you put a bill out there like this, everybody starts feeding on it. It becomes difficult to pass, and like I think we've seen over the last week, it just sort of collapses in the end.
And then, of course, last week we also had gun issues die.
There was one last attempt to put forward a bill that would allow people to openly carry weapons in Florida. Don Gates, a senator from out in the Panhandle, was going to try to attach that to another bill. In the end, he had to back away from it. But when we went into this session, there were two huge gun issues, one of which was to allow people to, if you have a concealed weapons license, to openly carry guns in Florida, which is happening in other states. And the other issue was to allow people with concealed carry permits to carry weapons on college and university campuses. Right. Both of those issues have died, and they both basically went down in the Senate Judiciary Committee, where they just can't get gun bills through that committee. So they were very controversial, especially early in the session when it looked like they had a chance. But they basically have been put to rest unless some miracle would happen here in the final week. There was another issue that was also sort of interesting. It was a little bit lower profile, but it would change the burden of proof in stand your ground cases. Right. The Senate actually passed that, but it got stalled in a House committee. There was another attempt towards last week or two to try to get that up in a House committee, and they decided not to. So that went down as well. All three of those bills were supported by the NRA and other Second Amendment groups, and it's sort of unusual for them to not be able to get legislation through. But it looks like at this point that they're all dead.
That is unusual. Also, is it due to the effort of environmentalists that the fracking bills were dead?
Again, I guess there's a recurring theme here. A lot of things are dying in the Senate. There was a bill in both the House and the Senate that would have set up sort of a regulatory framework for oil and gas drilling. But what the bill was really about was whether in the future fracking would be allowed in Florida and how it would be regulated. Very controversial, in part because it would have allowed the state to essentially have the regulatory authority and not local governments. Some local governments have passed bans on fracking, and as you might expect, the oil and gas industry didn't like that. So this bill was put out there to essentially give the state regulatory oversight. The state was going to conduct a study and do some other things. And there were no guarantees that fracking was going to happen in the future. But the environmentalists mobilized big time on this issue. And they argued that this was just going to pave the way for fracking. This was, down the road that fracking would happen in Florida. But they could not get this through the Senate committee. And even though it was sponsored by Garrett Richter, who's a senator from Naples, and he is a lieutenant of the Senate president, he could not get it through a committee. It had passed the House earlier, but they took two shots at it to try to get it through committee, and it didn't go. So it looks like it's dead. It is a big win for the environmentalists, at least this year. I mean, they mobilized on that. And some local governments were opposed to it as well because it would have taken away authority from local governments.
Right. And then, of course, we had the Uber, Lyft type services. That bill went to die too.
Yeah, it looks like it's dead. I mean, we're sitting here early in the final week, and there's still some discussions about that issue. But what's been going on with that issue is that these new transportation network services, Uber, Lyft, those sorts of things have. They've been looking for, the problem they have is that there's all sorts of local regulations popping up, and they want it regulated at the state, and they want it lightly regulated. The House passed a bill that essentially does that. But the Senate president particularly, and his rules chairman, the Senate president Andy Gardner, the rules chairman David Simmons, have taken a different tack. They basically say, the state shouldn't be getting involved in this, and they have focused only on insurance requirements for Uber, I say Uber, but these drivers for these services. At this point, the Senate is still sort of mulling this whole insurance issue, but they do not want to go anywhere near as far as the House wants to go. And a pretty telling sign that this whole issue is probably dead this year, is that Uber put out a news release last week and held a conference call that blasted the Senate president by name and personally, which is not usually the way to get policy done in the final week of session.
Right.
So, which is a pretty good indication that they think it's dead, or they wouldn't have been doing that. So, I mean, anything's possible in the final week. You got to always keep that into consideration. But it looks like that may have to come back again next year.
So we'll be expecting the governor's reaction to all of this and seeing whether or not he's going to be okay with the budget.
Well, I think his move on the budget is going to be very interesting to see. They have not gone along with his wishes on that either. Right. So,
thanks, Jim. For more news about Florida's government and public affairs, visit the Advances section of our website and keep coming back to Capitol Dateline Online for daily postings.